You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with cognitive neuroscientist Therese Houston to talk all about maximizing our brain health and power in midlife. So you won't want to miss that one. So come on back for that. And until then, as always, stay feisty. All right, Kristen, welcome back to the show. It's been a minute, but you're always a popular guest among our audience. So I'm glad to have you here again.
Yes, thanks so much, Celine. Yeah, I had a really good time on the supplements podcast, so I was excited to talk about this one, which is more food focused for this talk.
Let's get right into it. I mean, you are a major sports RD and you have some advice for us, the top tips right now for all kinds of things for women in peri and postmenopause. So, without further ado, let's talk some tips.
All right, tips we will talk. Um, I'll say to start out, like I pitched this idea to Celine because I really just wanted to give a lot of the foundational topics and information that I typically work with on clients that are active women or people that are in peri and postmenopause. So, really like low key, these are my secret tips for people in peri postmenopause that generally live active lives and that hopefully you'll get a lot out of it.
I am dying to know. So, what is your, and these are not, let's set the stage. These are not necessarily in any particular order, right? Like we're not counting down to our number one tip, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So what do you have that said first for us?
So, number one is the first thing that if I'm working with a client or that really, if anyone's trying to optimize their health and performance through nutrition, is making sure that they're meeting their energy availability. I know there's other podcast episodes that have been on here with Carla and other practitioners where pretty much everyone in sports medicine can agree that if the body isn't getting the energy it needs, it's not going to be able to perform any of the processes that it needs to. And it can be a bit startling for some people when they do start to calculate what their energy needs are. And there is, some interpretation of like how flexible those numbers are. But generally, like the first thing you would do if you were working with an RD or nutritionist is seeing where is your energy availability at in context of like what your needs are for that day, but also in the exercise that you're doing. So I think we talked about this before where energy availability is a term that is specific to people that are doing usually formal activities and exercise because it accounts for those extra calories that are being burned and need to be replaced by food.
So correct me if I'm wrong. I had Heidi Skolnick, do you know her, on?
Yep.
Yeah, she's written a lot on low energy availability, and she was on and she was explaining, which I thought was an important piece of information to understand, that in the beginning at least, and maybe for a while, you can be in low energy availability and still do your workouts, but other stuff will start to suffer at some point. Like you can, like if you're still running or you're still doing all these things, you might still be hitting your workouts, but then maybe your reproductive system is going to be like, I don't know what's happening, but we don't have enough energy for this stuff, right? Is that a good way to describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so how you can feel it can take quite a long time for people to actually notice the effects of them not eating enough calories for what their bodies need. And like you said, they might be able to be fine in their training. They might even progress for a while, but eventually they're going to plateau and it's going to get harder for them. But on top of that, like, something that's kind of specific to peri postmenopausal people is that when you have a menstrual cycle, assuming you're not taking birth control, you have that visible metric for if your body, one of the first things to shut down when we have low energy availability is the reproductive system. And so when we menstruate, we know, okay, at least that box is checked. But when we're in perimenopause or postmenopause, we don't have that metric. Like, we're expecting our periods to get farther apart, or we're expecting not to have one. So, but there are so many other physiological processes that are compromised when we don't have
Hmm.
enough energy. Things like bone density, really important for postmenopausal women. Maintaining lean body mass, like maybe you're able to do your exercise, but you're not actually building muscle or maintaining muscle. So that's another big one. Even things like gut symptoms.
Mm.
We'll talk about that. That'll be another tip. But a lot of people that I work with that have regular bloating, regular diarrhea, regular gut issues, it's like one of the main factors is they're usually chronically in low energy availability.
Oh, interesting. And I wonder, and maybe this is a bridge of speculation too far, but I also understand from my reading of the literature, and again, you're the expert, tell me if I'm on the right track here, that the carbohydrate availability drives energy availability, correct?
Yep. Yeah, we're just gonna go straight into tip number two,
Okay, let's do that.
which because you led me right there,
Okay.
which is to make sure that we're meeting at least like a minimum amount of carbohydrates for the day. So, depending on the practitioner, they might have different amounts that they're trying to get athletes to meet, and it'll also depend on like the type of exercise, the type of training. But definitely, we know that the endocrine system is affected by carbohydrate availability in addition to carb availability.
You mean in addition to energy? You said carb twice, I think.
Oh, carb availability in addition to energy availability.
Yes.
So,
Does the timing of them matter? Because I've seen some literature suggesting that if you have them on board when you need them, that helps too. Is that true?
yep. Yeah. So making sure that, especially for athletes that I'm working with that are doing endurance type exercise, so cycling, running, triathlon, swimming, really anything over like a VO2 max type effort, and even VO2 max type efforts require glucose and glycogen and the glycolytic pathway. So, in that way, making sure that postmenopausal women are fueling with carbohydrates before, during, and after exercise, because we know that even if they meet their carbs by the end of the day, even if they meet their total energy by the end of the day, if they're not having those carbohydrates around those training sessions, some of those endocrine system, like those hormonal functions, get disrupted.
Hmm. And this might be a little into the weeds, but I'm very curious about the idea of just raising your blood sugar or your blood glucose as opposed to like worrying about your glycogen stores because part of what I've been seeing is, this all interplays with the brain, right? Like what the brain is sensing and how everything is going. So you're not necessarily, when you eat like a cookie on a long run or before a long run, you're not necessarily putting a bunch of energy in, but it seems like you're signaling to your brain that you have the energy available. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. So, and it doesn't even have to be carbohydrates necessarily. Like we know that amino acids and like branched chain amino acids or even some protein rich foods can also uh, trigger that insulin response, which
Hmm.
allows for that glucose to be available. So, having something in, but usually carbohydrates are the most helpful. But you're
Yeah.
right. It's not like you eat 30 grams of carb and immediately your system's like it's all going to your bloodstream.
Right.
And especially in post menopause, we know that that response may be different than if they were premenopausal, but still like getting something in, especially carbs or amino acids, can be helpful to get that response.
What response might be different?
The
Pre and post?
glucose response.
Yeah, that's different with peri and postmenopausal women.
If depending on the type of athlete, there can be less insulin sensitivity.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. That makes sense. So practically speaking, with both of these things, which when you're talking about energy availability, when you're talking about carbohydrate intake, people get really confused. They don't know how much they need. They don't know how meticulous they need to be about this. Is there a high level range of advice you can give women for, active women for what they should be looking to take in, or is there a guide? Is there a calculator? Like, how can they at least get in the ballpark for themselves if they feel like they're like way off the mark or aren't sure?
Hmm. So, ballpark, I mean, first of all, having carbohydrate rich foods in all of your meals is
Mm.
priority number one. I mean, if you're not doing that now, that's a box that needs to be checked. So having at least like some serving of starchy vegetables, whole grains, those types of foods in every breakfast, every lunch, every dinner,
Okay.
making sure that you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that would be box number one. And then clinically, I would say anything below 3 grams of carb per kilogram body weight would be like
Okay.
an absolute minimum, like
Okay.
minimum for any person, any athlete for the day, like not depending on exercise you've done that day. We want to get at least 3 grams per kilogram body weight.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Anything else there before we move on to our next bucket?
We got carbs, we got carb timing, we got calories. So yeah, those are the three like top level. And this is somewhat progressive, as in like if these three boxes aren't checked, we don't even get to the other boxes yet. But
Right.
it's great
Right.
when I work with someone that already has these boxes checked because we can get to like deeper subjects, which is fun.
Are most women under eating
Yes.
that you work with? Yeah.
Blanket
Is it is
statement,
it
yes.
be is it intentional or unintentional, cultural, sociological? I mean, because they get this idea that breakfast should only be a piece of toast or maybe not even, I mean, or is it I wonder what if it's conditioning, or I don't know, everything. I maybe I'm trying to parse too much out.
Yeah, I would say generally people are the clients that I work with, and I do work with a lot of athletes that are in peri post menopause. I would say like on average, I have between like 5 and 25 clients that are in that age range every month that I work with. And I think at first they're not aware. And
Mm.
so maybe they weren't doing it intentionally, but they also like weren't aware. So then when we dive into it and I start to explain the research and we talk about like why we need these things, then I do start to see some of the dieting, like food restrictions come in. And it can be, they're really helpful conversations because we do need to unpack some of these beliefs and in order to get to the point where we feel comfortable getting in what we need.
Yeah, and trusting, and I still struggle with this. I mean, there will be days when I am just really hungry and I have to tell myself it is okay to eat. You should eat. You are really hungry. You're training a lot. But we're so conditioned, to not quote unquote overeat or to whatever that means. And I always feel so much better when I eat, when I'm actually
Mm-hmm.
fueled, when I perform better. And it's just a lesson that I feel like I'm going to be relearning for the rest of my life.
Yep, absolutely. And I think like certain foods too, with like certain generations have been annexed, a lot of like we call them carbs, but they're a lot of the time those foods are like not even that carb rich.
Mm,
But even, yeah, even eating breakfast has been kind of a common barrier I've had to help athletes manage in order to get where they need to be.
yeah. Yeah, I can see that. All right, let's say that we have maybe not mastered, but we're on the track for these top ones that you've just said. What is next?
Next one, I would put protein in there.
Okay.
Yep. So, daily protein needs for peri postmenopause, typically I'll use 1.8 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight.
Yep.
Maybe 1.6 depending on the athlete, but usually 1.8 to 2.2.
Yeah.
Again, if we're at the minimum, we're within the reference range. So, like, we don't need to be pushing to the high. We're not really necessarily gaining anything by getting to the high amount, but like, that's like a threshold that I'm looking at.
Yeah. Yeah, I just had Bill Campbell on the show, and he is protein researcher, and that's pretty much the range he gave too. And he does for his peri and postmenopausal women like to try to get them a little into the higher range sometimes, just to see if that helps with muscle protein synthesis, just because some people can become so resistant with age, especially
Hmm.
and with. Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the reason I have the range in there is just practically speaking, the recommendation is based on body weight. So, an athlete that's naturally in a bigger body,
Yeah.
we can get into the 200-gram
It
range,
becomes a
which
full-time job to try to eat that much
exactly.
protein.
So the range is helpful. Like, and then athletes in smaller bodies, a lot of the time tend to not overeat protein, but they're eating beyond the 2.2. So
Right. Right.
pretty
That's a good
easily, like
range.
without trying very hard.
And that also we want distributed throughout the day.
Yes. Yeah. Ideally, a minimum of 3 doses, ideally 4 or 5. And each time that someone is eating protein rich foods, it's about the same amount at each of those time points. So that's an ideal world. But again, there's a range. So if an athlete's protein needs are 120 grams for the day, then we want to get 4 doses of 30 grams of
Mhm.
protein by the end of the day.
And what are your feelings on bedtime protein? Women in this demographic are often told like, "Oh, don't eat 2 to 3 hours before bed; it'll wreck your sleep." And then I read research like, "Oh, a little bedtime snack with protein is actually good for muscle and all of that." So where do you fall on that?
I think it's helpful for a couple of reasons. One, if an athlete is getting to the end of the day and they're not at their threshold, then topping it off is a great way to meet daily needs. But we also know that leucine, which is an amino acid, has been shown to reduce muscle protein degradation that happens when you sleep. There's newer research coming out, and this is in younger athletes, but helping to improve like muscle strength. And usually that's because the adaptation is better when they're having protein before bed. And there's also research to support that protein rich snack before bed helps to improve sleep quality.
Hmm.
And this may not be true for everyone, but I think it's definitely a helpful habit to get in.
Yeah. And you don't have to have a giant meal. I think that's the difference, right? People, you don't need to consume a ribeye before you go to bed, but maybe a
No,
like a
definitely not.
little Greek yogurt or some nuts or something is not a bad idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. What is our next tip?
All right. So now that we've covered what I call our foundational needs, making sure we're meeting our calorie and our macronutrient, I didn't mention fat because personally in my practice, like it's fat rich foods just taste so good. And I don't know if I've ever had an athlete I worked with that didn't meet their fat needs. So it's just not something we don't need to like address something that's already taken care of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next piece I'll work on is incorporating foods that are helpful for optimizing gut health. And this includes like prebiotic and probiotic rich foods.
Okay.
So, and again, these types of foods check multiple boxes. So one of the ones that, depending on what the client came to me to work on, will focus on incorporating more cruciferous vegetables. which I think you talked about on the pod before. So cruciferous vegetables help to address some of the estrogen dominance that happens in perimenopause and has actually been linked to reducing the severity of symptoms.
Hmm. Is that because they contain the thing I can't pronounce, but it's DIM for short?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And in uh, that same application, also soy and soy rich foods that are like from soybeans that have the isoflavones.
Hmm.
So not necessarily soy ingredients, but like tempeh, tofu, edamame. These types of foods have been shown to have similar effects, and those isoflavones can help to reduce the severity of symptoms.
And you're getting a nice amount of fiber, which is really important for this demographic too, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And so those fibers are also helpful for digestive health and gut health. So, and on top of that, when we incorporate a lot of these foods that are pre and probiotic rich, they also add a lot of nutrient density, like vitamins and minerals. Generally, they're filling, they add flavor, like they just check a lot of boxes. So I think like, in this day and age, a lot of people think gut health is kind of a sexy, fun topic. And so if I'm talking to clients and I'm like, these things are going to help your gut health, then they're more inspired to actually incorporate them.
What are the prebiotic ones? We always talk about the probiotics as the fermented, the kefir, the kimchi.
Yep. So some of the foods that have a lot of prebiotics, so they are going to be your cruciferous vegetables, which are
Okay.
like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and then also things like beets. There's some random ones in there like artichoke hearts and
So random.
asparagus.
Dandelion greens. You see it's like the strangest things. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but also things like whole grains.
Hmm.
So, quinoa, farro, amaranth, steel cut oats, brown rice. A lot of these have these prebiotic rich foods as well.
Excellent. And then for the probiotics, I mean, a lot of people want to take supplements, and where do you fall on probiotic supplements?
Yeah, my best advice with probiotic supplements, there are a fair amount of really well researched strains. The things to look out for if you're considering one are that they have the CFUs listed. So, like, if they say something like lactobacillus, but they don't say like how many CFUs, you don't actually know how much of the unit that's actually going to be productive for what you're using it for will be there. So make sure they have that listed. You're using a specific strain for a specific need. So you're not just taking it blanket.
Hmm.
And also, what a lot of people don't know is most of the effective probiotics require them to be refrigerated.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I really, unfortunately, don't see a lot of people refrigerating their probiotics, but like most of the researchers will tell you that they're not nearly as effective or they might have died by the time you open the package and they're not in the fridge anymore.
And in the case of many other nutrients, they work synergistically with other nutrients as naturally occurring in food. I mean, beta carotene comes to mind. When they pulled that out and gave it as a supplement, it caused problems. Like it,
Yep.
it, it wasn't a great idea. Um, I imagine the probiotics might have the same issue since, there's so many, like to your point, you're like, what are you taking them for? What do you need? Do you need all of this or do you need another kind, right? Like, can you run into problems taking them?
Yeah. And I was reading some research recently. I didn't actually read the full study, so I'm just going to blanket statement what I
Okay.
remember. But essentially, there are certain strains that can even like inhibit efficacy of things like antibiotics,
Oh, interesting.
or also like delay your body's ability to recover from the antibiotics.
So global point is probably to try to get them from food.
Yes, try to get them
Yeah.
from food. And if you are going to use a supplement, do your research on like the strain and like the application of why you're using it.
Yeah. Is there any, I hear people getting their, gut biome tested and microbiome tested and all that. Is there applicability to doing that? Do you see a reason that people might want to do that?
I think if someone has severe chronic gut issues,
Hmm.
we have pretty good information about and like testing to determine, what are contributing factors to those severe symptoms, which would be like chronic diarrhea,
Yeah.
chronic constipation, where you're not like having a stool for up to 3 days. So these are pretty severe. And at that point, definitely gut testing would be applicable. I think earlier than that, just for like the every person, we're not that far off. Like there are a lot of really interesting tests coming out, but I don't necessarily recommend it for like everyone that comes through my door to get those kinds of tests done.
Yeah. Excellent. And to be clear, some people are really, in this audience too, are really testing their guts quite a bit when I'm thinking ultra marathoners and people
Mm-hmm.
who are, their guts are taking quite a beating, exercising, trying to process, having a bunch of sugar dumped into it. So, uh, gut health, gut health becomes exponentially more important. Uh,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And again, like I've worked with a lot of ultra runners that have these like pretty viscerally terrible gut symptoms of either during exercise, like
That's
during
what I
a
was thinking.
race.
Mm.
Yeah, yikes. But the first thing I look at there again is energy availability.
Mm.
Um, and not that we're trying to get the athlete to replace the 12,000 calories they're burning that day, but leading into the race chronically through their training load, like, does their body have enough energy to support the amount of training they're doing and their gut health to get them there on race day?
Oh, interesting. Good point. Thank you. All right. What's up next?
All right. So, again, focusing more on foods,
Hmm.
we'll work on incorporating more foods that are anti-inflammatory
Okay. This is
or
a
have
big one.
anti-inflammatory properties. Yep.
Hmm.
So, and this was plugging myself, but this was my master's thesis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my master's thesis focused on developing dietary interventions to lower chronic inflammatory markers in postmenopausal women. Our population, our participants were like in the obese BMI, and most of them were pretty inactive. So I think it's a little bit different population than a lot of people listening to this podcast. But what we do know is that when estrogen goes down in postmenopause, that increases chronic inflammatory markers, which then can lead to and or is associated with chronic disease risk, and also bone density issues.
Hmm.
So one of the main things we try to do is help people incorporate strategies into their day and their week and their month to incorporate more of these anti-inflammatory rich foods.
Such as.
Such as, so the most potent ones are going to be omega-3 rich foods. And these are things like fatty fish, salmon, sardines, mackerel, herring, fatty tuna. So, like sushi tuna, not like low fat canned tuna, which is also delicious. It just doesn't have as many omega 3s in it.
Yeah.
So, those, and also things like flax seeds, chia seeds, and seaweed. So, finding ways for people to incorporate these foods into their day, into their week, and ultimately just getting more of those omega 3s in. And on top of that, also flavors. So, certain foods like garlic, turmeric, cinnamon, cayenne, ginger, these foods all have strong anti inflammatory properties and are also delicious. They just
Hmm.
make food taste really good. So,
Yeah.
Incorporating these foods, again, are just adding a lot of those really potent anti-inflammatory properties.
And for people who are sitting there saying, "My God, I hate fish. Can I just take a supplement?" Is this a place where can you take a supplement?
It doesn't replace the food.
Okay.
So, like if you didn't, if you had your supplement that day, that doesn't mean the salmon that you would have eaten later wasn't going to help.
Right. I understand that.
That makes sense. The
I'm
supplement doesn't
guessing.
replace the food, but it would be
Yeah.
helpful in addition. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other things? I mean, I hear sometimes about blueberries and that kind of thing having some anti-inflammatory properties. Is there something
hmm
to be said about that?
Yep. So foods that have antioxidants in them, such as
Mm,
like anthocyanins and vitamin A rich foods, vitamin C rich foods, these are also antioxidants. So things like citrus, lemon,
yep.
lime, oranges, berries, kiwis are actually super high in vitamin C. And then anything orange is going to have vitamin A usually. So carrots, papaya, sweet potatoes, bell peppers. These foods also will have these antioxidants, which are also anti-inflammatory.
Excellent. All right.
Okay, so now that we've met our foundational calorie, energy, macros, we've dialed in our gut health, we have incorporated the anti-inflammatory rich foods. Um, and a lot of these other strategies also, when we end up talking a lot about what we can include, it takes the emphasis on what we aren't including.
Mm,
So, and I say that because, a lot of the clients I have in that are peri postmenopause, just the generation that they lived in, there's so much emphasis on what you shouldn't eat.
mm,
And I think like one of my approaches is really focusing on what is like best to eat helps to even drive the conversation away from like what we shouldn't eat. And
right.
that's really helpful.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So sometimes I'll work with people to incorporate, like try to limit the ultra processed foods that they're eating and incorporate more of the unprocessed or less processed foods. But a lot of the time by this point, I don't even have to
Hmm.
because they're so excited about all these foods that are going to help them. They don't even like focus on the foods that are going to be less helpful for them.
When you have the conversations about processed and ultra processed foods, where does sports nutrition come into that conversation?
It does come into the conversation because it's a natural question to ask. Like if we're, I think anytime we're talking about what the priorities are for the person and also what's going to help them for like their long-term success, things like sports food and processed foods when it comes to sports do make sense. To a certain extent, like one thing I tell a lot of my younger clients is like, it's in my opinion, if we're struggling to meet our energy needs, and a lot of the time that happens on like high volume training days, then having those processed foods is going to be really, really helpful to getting
Right.
our calories and our macros met. And that's going to be more important than focusing on like the quality or the type of food.
Right. I mean, I remember yeah, I've been in this game a long time, as
hmm
people know, but like there was somebody who was trying to um, make pouches of potato, but they were so heavy and you needed so much potato. You know what I mean? To get the
Oh,
same
yeah.
amount of like what you needed. And I was like, I like the idea of having like some roast, some boiled potatoes or salted potatoes as a snack for very long things, but to carry a bunch of pouches of potato was it wasn't happening.
Yeah, it was not happening. So,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, like, it's got to be practical. It's got to be logistically, like, make sense. And at the end of the day, like, we want our nutrient needs to be met
yeah.
at the minimum. So,
All right.
okay. Now, and then the last piece really is, should we or what's the application of certain supplements?
Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to touch on it.
Yep.
Um,
Let's do it.
and I did the whole podcast episode on supplements. So there we talked about making sure that the brand that you're taking is third party tested and has what it says it has in it and how much, and that it doesn't have other things in it. All of the supplements that Hit Play Not Pause recommends all have those third party testing
Yep.
certifications. So good job
Thank
there.
you. I
Yes.
feel very, very strongly about that.
Absolutely. So, and then at that point, what are the applications? So, talking about what type of athlete the person is engaged in, or what type of sport the athlete's engaged in. What are the goals of the training or the competition? And so, some of the common ones that I work with that I recommend, the first one would be creatine
Hmm.
to peri postmenopausal athletes. It can help to improve any kind of performance of activities that are like 30 seconds or less, where they're using that phosphocreatine system. So if they're doing like sprint work or lifting, the performance will improve here, but also that helps to build lean body mass. And so when we're
Right.
trying pretty diligently to maintain or even grow lean body mass in this life stage, creatine can be a really helpful application there. And then it's also, we know it's super safe. So there's really not a downside for most people. Some people experience water retention, but some people don't.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about bloating here and there. Do you ever hear of somebody come to you with that? And is there advice for that?
I have heard of bloating. One, if people do too high of doses, so if they
Hmm.
do more than 5 grams at one time, or if they take it by itself. So, like if you were
Oh,
to, take 5 grams or 10 or 20 or however much, like in the morning with water and didn't eat for like an hour, that could definitely cause some bloating.
oh, interesting. Hmm.
Yeah. But I think if the dose is around 5 grams and you're taking it around a meal or snack, it's usually, I really haven't had, I personally haven't had any clients that have experienced the bloating, but that doesn't mean other people don't.
Yeah. No, that's good advice.
Yeah. So, one of the other common ones that I recommend is beta alanine for endurance athletes.
Hmm.
So, this is again a supplement that is needed to be taken chronically in order to build up in the system. And this can help with training adaptations and performance for something in that like 1 minute to 15 minute time frame. But even longer than that, it's been shown to be effective for performance. So,
What's the mechanism there?
so beta alanine is a buffer.
Mm.
And so when we're doing efforts that are really taxing the ability of hydrogen ions that are getting converted into lactic acid, then when we can raise that buffer, we can go longer or at a higher wattage, a higher capacity at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to be clear for both of these, I can imagine some people hearing, well, I don't really care about my sprint performance, I don't really care about this, but it's making your training better, which makes your performance better across the board. And I
Yes.
think sometimes that gets lost. Yeah.
Yep. And I think like a lot of people they may not think they care, but then when they see like their numbers going up or they're not
Mm.
breathing as hard or their muscles are growing or they're like lifting more weights than they were, they're like, "Oh, maybe I didn't know I cared about this."
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So getting that like positive feedback can be really fun.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I use both of those. So
Yeah.
do we have another on the list?
Yeah, and then as far as like managing symptoms for perimenopause, there are quite a few different adaptogens which can help to manage stress, and then other applications of herbs that can be helpful to manage symptoms.
Such as?
Such as the most common one that I recommend is, well, the two are either ashwagandha or rhodiola.
Mm-hmm.
And these have been shown, again, taken chronically to address like mood disturbances and also overall like anxiety and the feeling of stress. So
Yeah.
those, and then today I was actually researching black cohosh because it is like one of the most well-studied herbs for perimenopause symptoms. And it's been used for like hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So, like, whether we say, whether we have clinical trials saying it's helpful or just people have been using it historically for a long time, that's hard to say. Also, like, the form might be different. Like, we're not pulling it out of the ground and
Mm,
making it into a tea. We're
right.
usually like growing it, drying it, putting it in a capsule or something like that. But certain types of black cohosh have also been shown to reduce symptoms. And there was actually one type that there's clinical trials showing that it can be not as effective as menopausal hormone therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's like really close to being
Hmm.
as effective. But it's in this like one type of extract. So they figured out how to get the specific compound in black cohosh like in a form that was really effective.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to maybe drop that in the show notes if we can find
Mm-hmm.
that. Mm-hmm.
I can send it to you. And that's, somewhat you could say beyond like the scope of a registered dietitian recommending something like that. But as far as I'm aware, it's pretty safe and it's over the counter. So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's another one. Pika, I'm not going to get the name of it right. I'm going to have to look it up. There's another one that sort of flies under the radar that I have heard come up a few times that now that I mention it, I'm not even going to remember the name of it. Which we might just cut Carrie because this
yeah.
is going to be useless. Um, no, I mean I think that that might be going back to the Black Cohosh. I think that quote that that's sort of like, leaving the lane a little bit, but when you're taking care of the whole person, where do those lines get drawn? Yeah, it's hard to tell. You're trying to help somebody perform their best, and if symptoms are in the way, well, that you're helping them perform their best.
hmm Yeah. And I think one last point on the supplements too is um, the creatine, beta alanine, um, ashwagandha, rhodiola. As far as I'm aware, none of those have like drug interactions.
Mm-hmm.
But one piece of advice, if you are going to consider herbal supplements or also probiotics, definitely need to check with your doctor to make sure they're not going to have any kind of drug interactions.
If you're taking other medications.
Correct.
Yeah. No, that's always good advice. So is there anything else that you had on your list that we haven't talked about?
As far as nutrition application, no, but like a big part of working with clients as a registered dietitian is just putting all this into practice, right?
Yep.
And setting manageable, practical goals for yourself that are incremental, like one at a time, a few at a time, to in order to make these things happen. So, like making sure and I always like to get a full picture with an assessment first so I can provide recommendations that check multiple boxes, right? Like an example would be incorporating more sweet potatoes. So sweet potatoes, they are going to have carbs.
Mm-hmm.
They're easy to digest that you can have around training. They're going to have the vitamin A, like the antioxidant rich foods. They also have some prebiotics in them. They taste good. They're relatively cheap, like making those kind of recommendations and thinking about how can you solve multiple problems or multiple challenges with one
Mm.
strategy.
Yeah, that's really good advice because people get super overwhelmed, as you know, and I feel like when you parse it out the way we have over a whole podcast, it can feel overwhelming. But then when you break it down like that, it's less overwhelming because it is just it doesn't take that many changes to implement what you're talking about, right?
Exactly. Yep. For
Yeah.
most people, you can get it done. But it's always best to do it incrementally. So
Yeah.
working through over a period of like weeks to months to slowly incorporate these changes. In the literature, we know it takes about 3 months to develop a habit and then
Hmm.
6 months to maintain a habit. So, if you decide to like strive towards eating breakfast every day, it can take about 3 months for you to like solidify that. And then to maintain it, it'll be another 3 months.
So not just a week in January.
Probably not a week in January. Uh-huh. You might be super successful for a week, but then it's going to drop off.
Yeah. Yeah, and finding things that you genuinely enjoy are really, really important there, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's one of the first questions I ask in my intake is like, are there foods that you absolutely just won't eat? Maybe it's not a food that you consider to be a restriction, but like, if you're not going to eat it, what's the difference? And
Yeah.
so, making food enjoyable, making it pleasurable, and finding ways and like developing tools and strategies to make that happen.
Excellent. I guess the final question I have for you is there's a lot of there's a lot of people giving a lot of diet and nutrition advice out there, and you know, myself included, I have, a precision nutrition coaching certification. But that's not the same as somebody who is like yourself, who is dedicated and gone to school and studies this stuff. So how can people figure out if they want to work with somebody? And I know this can be a little sensitive because you don't necessarily have to be an RD, but like how can people figure out like the best practitioner to hire?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it depends on what your goals are, in my opinion. And also, it depends on what are some other factors that the practitioner should or could consider. So, like if you have preconceived medical diagnoses, or you're taking medications, or you're working through like diagnosed health issues, or maybe undiagnosed, but there's a problem. um, at that point, it would be helpful to work with someone that has medical training,
Mm,
right? So that would be a registered dietitian, someone that has the RD credential. They'll have the expertise to work with that. But let's say you generally feel healthy, like you aren't taking any medications, or if you are, they're like well managed, and really you're just looking to like build good habits. In that case, somebody with even like a health coaching certification or something like a precision nutrition is really like enough because that support, I strongly believe in that kind of support. I think a lot of people will benefit from just having someone break it down with them and like go through that goal setting strategy session
mm,
and figuring out what they need to be successful. There's also other ways to do things. Like there's practitioners like myself that, and also Feisty, you all have great e-courses and like the
mm,
fueled courses. So I'll say from a practitioner standpoint, when an athlete comes to me, wanting to work one-on-one, if they already have like a pretty good base of knowledge, we can get into the deeper subjects more quickly, and then, they end up only needing me for a few sessions where,
right.
like, if I'm teaching somebody what a carbohydrate is, and we're talking about like where calories come from, it could be many months of one on one time. So I think taking that approach can be really helpful too, like looking into like evidence-based resources that are made for them. And then hiring a practitioner can also be
Mm.
a helpful way to go.
Yeah, I agree with that. Having a base of knowledge makes the sessions more productive in a lot of ways. I'm curious about for people. who are dedicated recreational athletes taking that seriously, an RD won't necessarily understand sports nutrition the way that you might want them to, depending what their focus is. Is there a way to tell if somebody is more qualified for that purpose?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question too. So like if a person is like um I mean especially if they are interested in like performance-based
Yeah.
nutrition strategies, but even basic needs like in school, I will tell you like when I got my undergrad and my internship to become an RD, there was exactly zero training in sports nutrition. Like there
Well.
wasn't even a day of education. I took sports nutrition as an elective in grad school, and then have done like a lot of research and also got my credential, which requires a lot more education. But so yeah, just hiring an RD is usually not enough for someone that is like specifically like doing more than 5 hours a week of exercise or has like performance specific nutrition needs. In that case, getting like looking for a practitioner that has the certified specialist for sports dietetics. So that's the CSSD.
Mhm.
That's the highest level sports nutrition certification. There are others, such as ACSM has their own, like American College of Sports Medicine has their own sports nutrition course certification. I believe the ISSN also does, International Society of Sports Nutrition. Um, and then usually if a person is like competing in their own sport that's the same sport that you're competing in,
Mm.
they should have at least the contextual information that they need for the
Yeah.
athlete.
Right.
So at minimum, like they'll understand the context of like what that athlete needs.
Perfect. Well, another session down, Kristen. Is there anything that you would like to leave the audience with about any of this that we have talked about?
I think the only thing I'd leave, the one thing I want to leave everyone with is a lot of this information is really valuable, but it's only as valuable as when you put it into like practical steps for yourself. So again, just emphasizing like start small with small goals, and that'll ultimately lead to a lot more success.
Excellent. I will stop recording. Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with cognitive neuroscientist Therese Houston to talk all about maximizing our brain health and power in midlife. So you won't want to miss that one. So come on back for that. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause, and please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends, and please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.